crashes in a short period of time in those early minutes of flight. What do we know at this point?
Well, what we know is that this troubling crash, this tragic incident, behind me, you can see those big diggers, Jim. They are separating parts of the engine of this, what was a brand new Boeing, from parts of the fuselage. There's also been the very tragic moments of bringing out the remains of those lost on this flight. And there have been officials from the U.S., other countries, and of course Ethiopian Airlines on the scene in this hillside in Ethiopia. Just moments ago, I spoke to a witness who says he was tending his sheep. He's a shepherd. This is a very rural area of Ethiopia. When he heard the noise that seemed unusual, of a plane coming over, he said when he came out to look, there were flames, as he put it, towards the tail side of the plane. Relatively soon after that, it smashed into this hillside, creating a crater, Jim, that's about as big as 2 basketball fields. This was just a horrendous, catastrophic impact into the hillside. No survivors. Earlier, we spoke to the U.S. ambassador who was here on the scene. Take a listen.
8 Americans, showing the diversity of our country and showing, as you say, great interest in Africa. People who either lived here or were here to work and to contribute to the development of this continent. 8 inspiring lives and 8 true tragedies, and our hearts go out to everyone who was impacted by their deaths.
Well, Jim, the ambassador said that the investigators are on their way here. They'll be here overnight. He also said that Interpol is working with U.S. and Ethiopian authorities to try identify the remains of those lost in this terrible incident. Jim?
David McKenzie there, right at the scene of that crash, as only CNN can do it. I want to bring in now David Susi, CNN safety analyst, also a former FAA inspector. He's also author of Malaysian Airlines Flight 370, Why It Disappeared and Why It's Only a Matter of Time Before It Happens Again. David, tough question for you this morning. You used to be with the FAA. You have a number of countries around the world who have grounded this aircraft. Should the FAA follow suit here in this country and ground the 737 MAX?
If I was in that position at this point, there's not enough information to tell us that it's not that. So to be cautious, I would definitely do that in the FAA.
Okay, that would be quite a step. Let me ask you this as well, because I've got a flight with my family coming up. I found myself this morning, like I think a lot of Americans, looking at those websites where it shows you what the equipment is for that flight. Should Americans be concerned about whether it's safe to fly on this plane right now?
You know, Jim, I've never ever done this before. I've never said that, hey, it's unsafe to fly a particular model of aircraft. But in this case, I'm going to have to go there. I just looked at the flight data off of that aircraft. It's strikingly similar, same issues that Lion Air had with the MAX Air. So, yeah, I would watch for that airplane. I'm so sorry to say that. But
it's quite a remarkable, in my experience with you, David, talking to you through the years, I know that you do not, you go out of your way to be conservative in the recommendations you make. Speak for a moment so folks at home understand, because I've read a little bit about this, and what seemed to happen in Lion Air, and again, it's early with the Ethiopian Airways crash, although it was in a similar time period of the flight, is that you have the pilots literally fighting, it seemed, the automatic control systems on the plane. Can you explain in layman's terms what we know about the first crash 5 months ago and what those circumstances would be like?
Jim, it's really a complex issue. I'll do the best I can. But basically what happened is with this MAX Air airplane, the reason it changed is because they moved the engines a little bit more forward, then the wing is slightly different than it is on previous 737s. Because of that, they took a precautionary measure to have an automated system that, because with that configuration, the nose tends to go up. So they put in a system in there that when that happens, it would automatically push the nose down. So this, I believe, this is what happened in Lion Air. We don't know, again, whether this happened in this aircraft yet or not. However, what this does is when the autopilot is turned off, even with it off, this system still pushes the nose down if it thinks that the nose is going up uncommanded. So if there's a failure in the angle of attack indicator, which tells the airplane whether it's climbing or not, if there's a failure in that system, then this system, this precautionary measure system will push the nose down. So the pilot is literally fighting against something, and he may not even be aware. He'll turn the autopilot off and not understand that it's another system that he needs to turn off to avoid this. So they'll keep fighting it, thinking it's an aerodynamic error on the airplane or something.
That's
something
very
wrong physically
interesting.
with the aircraft.
Even if he turns off the autopilot, there's another system that might still be overriding the pilot's moves. I understand that after the Lion Air crash, that Boeing held classes, in effect, special training sessions for pilots, so that they could better understand the systems on this plane. Do we know how extensive they were? And would we know if, for instance, the pilots on this most recent plane had been given extra training for this aircraft?
I'm sure that they did. I mean, this was a big deal. I'm sure you recall, Boeing reacted very quickly, which was unprecedented, really. They didn't wait for the FAA or any other regulatory body to tell them what to do. They did it. They realized that there was an issue and they addressed it quickly. That's why I'm really hesitant to say that this is the same problem with this airplane, because they took extreme measures to try to prevent it from happening. So that's where I've got a little bit of confusion right now, is why did this happen again if it was indeed this same problem?
Right, but we heard your message there loud and clear that the FAA, in your view, needs to take a step and ground these planes now until we know more. David Soucy, former FAA staffer, thanks very much for joining us this morning. The other news this morning, it is a month late, hundreds of millions of dollars short, and even though it has no chance of becoming a reality, it is sure to set off another ferocious battle between President Trump and Congress. It is the president's budget plan for 2020, which arrived on Capitol Hill within the last hour. Those are the pictures there, those big, thick books, delayed because of that government shutdown, and utterly dismissed by Democrats, and this is crucial, even by some Republicans. Here is the first of many non-starters for Democrats, $8.6 billion for President Trump's desired wall, plus, on top of that, reimbursement of the military construction funds that the president is commandeering with his emergency decree. CNN's Alison Kosik joins me now to break it all down. So let's look at these numbers here. Big picture for folks at home following this. There's obviously that big number, requested money for the border wall. What else is in the president's budget?
Okay, so let me start off with the other stuff. So President Trump's new budget is overall setting up a new battle over the border. What he is promising to do is balance the federal budget in 15 years by slashing spending for education, for health, the environment, and other non-defense items. The proposal, which rolls out this morning, it amounts to a total of $2.7 trillion in spending cuts. So the president is going to be looking to reduce spending by 5% across federal agencies, except for defense spending. So what this budget essentially does, Jim, is it pushes down spending in some areas like the EPA, and it looks to increase funding in other areas that align with the president's priorities. The administration will invest more than $80 billion for veteran services and increase resources to fight the opioid epidemic. High on the president's agenda, he will try to get $8.6 billion for a border wall. And so broken down, as you showed, it's a reimbursement of $3.6 billion in military construction funds that he hopes will be spent this year. This is coming from that declaration of a national emergency. And it also includes the $5 billion for customs and border protection. Now, once this budget comes out, I'm going to give you a pretty good roadmap now of what's going to happen here, according to analyst Greg Valliere. Both parties will exploit this morning's new budget, with Democrats blasting deep domestic spending cuts and Republicans calling for a huge defense spending hike, which partly goes to fund a border wall. Here's the thing with this. The timing of actually working out this budget, it could present a perfect storm. The debate on spending and budget caps will also intertwine this fall with negotiations to raise the debt ceiling. Here's a reminder for you. On March 2nd, we hit the $22 trillion debt ceiling, or the federal borrowing limit that Congress sets. The Treasury Department is actually in the middle of using what's known as extraordinary measures to continue to pay the country's bills. So get ready. Come September, you are going to probably see the debate continue right up until the wire. I bet we have a countdown clock on CNN. This is as a debt ceiling crisis starts to really bubble up, because everybody, Jim, is just going to kick the can down the road. Jim?
Yep. That's the one consistency. When those deadlines come, in the end, they agree, let's raise the debt ceiling.
Right.
Alison Kosik, we'll be watching. Thanks very much. This budget from the president setting the table for another clash with Congress. What are lawmakers saying about it this morning? Plus, on the same week, Republicans are set to rebuke the president's national emergency. A new poll of Iowa Republicans show that 63% say it was the right thing to do. And this. Live on the ground there as U.S.-backed forces fight to take over the terror group's last stronghold. We're going to take you there.
If you see traces of
Trump has picked a brand new fight with Congress over government spending in general and the wall in particular. CNN's Manu Raju is on Capitol Hill. Manu, the government shut down over far less than $2 billion in spending for the wall. Any appetite for the more than $8 billion that the president is now asking for?
Certainly not from Democrats who now control the House. Of course, they're making it very clear that this budget proposal is dead on arrival. The House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, along with the Democratic leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, making it clear that the president's demands will not pass muster with Democrats, and the president will have to back down from his approach, as he did during the fight that led to the government shutdown earlier this year. The president ultimately agreeing to move forward and not getting $1 for his wall, and then later making that emergency declaration to try to move money around the federal government administratively around Congress to get money for his wall, but going through Congress for this more than $8 billion is not going to happen. This is what Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer said. President Trump hurt millions of Americans and caused widespread chaos when he recklessly shut down the government to try to get his expensive and ineffective wall, which he promised would be paid for by Mexico. Congress refused to fund his wall, and he was forced to admit defeat and reopen the government. The same thing will repeat itself if he tries this again. We hope he learned his lesson. Now, one of the things the Democrats are particularly concerned about from this budget proposal is also the call to decrease domestic funding that's not related to defense by 5% and increase defense spending. That is something also the Democrats will not accept. These budget proposals are ultimately blueprints that set the stage for fights later on during this budget process. So expect this fight to intensify later this fall as we get close to that fiscal deadline. And ultimately, Jim, the question is for the president, will he demand the money? Will he dig in again? And will that lead to another government shutdown? And this week, we'll see the Senate take a bipartisan vote to rebuke him on that emergency declaration vote. They're going to vote to pull back that measure. The president will veto that disapproval resolution. But nevertheless, bipartisan concern about what he's doing administratively, and Democrats are making it clear this budget proposal is not going anywhere. Jim?
So much of this about 2020 electioneering, no question. Manu Raju, thanks very much. Let's discuss now with Rana Foroohar, global business columnist and associate editor for the Financial Times, and Douglas Holtz-Eakin. He's the former director of the Congressional Budget Office here. So you got a big deficit. We know that. But you also have a lot of spending. And there's a lot of the president now, as many predicted, looking for cuts in spending as opposed to any change to those tax cuts. Rana, just looking purely at the numbers, what's the problem here? Is it more the tax cuts, or is it increased spending in the most recent budget cycle?
Well, when I look at this budget, I see a budget that really isn't very conservative. I mean, you can understand why Democrats don't like it. He's talking about increasing military spending, cutting back on domestic spending, which is frankly exactly what you need right now to boost domestic growth. But he's also not really addressing the debt and deficit issues in the way that he had promised. If you remember, President Trump had said that he was going to solve the entire debt and deficit problem in during his presidency. He's now saying, all right, we can balance the budget 15 years out, but only by shifting that increase in military spending into this separate slush fund. By the way, military spending at a time when we're actually pulling back from 2 overseas wars and spending money on a wall for, frankly, a manufactured immigration crisis when there is so much productive spending that could be done at home, I think isn't going to get you the growth that you need to actually balance the budget in general.
Douglas, the Democrats are noting in particular the effects of the president's tax cut, President and Republican Congress's tax cut, noting that it added nearly $2 trillion to deficits, I believe that over 10 years. And that's CBO number, right? I mean, those are CBO numbers there. It's a nonpartisan. You work for the CBO. Are they right to say that the tax cut is responsible for the lion's share of the increase in deficit?
They're correct to identify that as the increase in deficit, but it's not the biggest part of our problem. When President Trump came into office, we had $10 trillion in deficits on the books. That's largely the explosion of entitlement spending with the retirement of the baby boom. The tax cuts certainly made that worse. I think looking forward, anybody who looks at the numbers carefully knows that we're going to need three things. We're going to need very good economic growth. The president's counting on that. We're going to need reductions in spending, but not just the annual discretionary spending. We need to take on the entitlement spending, and we're going to need more revenue. No one wants to talk about any of those three things. This is a budget that's silent on the big issues.
Yeah, no question. I mean, that's all the adults in Washington say we got to get around the table and do that, but of course they don't get around the table because no one wants to tell their supporters, right?
Wait, there's adults
they have to
in
give
Washington?
anything up, right? Yeah, I mean, I've given up.
I think Douglas is making a very important point. You ultimately need growth to balance budgets. You know, I mean, that's
Right.
what that was the magic of the Clinton period, right? You know, you got the deficit down by growing. How do you grow, particularly at the end of an economic cycle? I mean, recovery cycles tend to last about a decade. We are over 10 years into this one. Now, the Trump administration will say, hey, we said we were going to get higher growth last year, and we did. And when we did, they still didn't meet their target. That was because of the saccharine sort of sugar high of this tax cut, which is now petered out. So this year, and certainly into next year, 2020, most economists feel we're going to be heading towards recession.
Now, on the spending side, the most recent budget, I mean, you just lay it out, it traded increases in defense spending, a Republican priority, for increases in other spending programs that were more Democratic priorities there. I mean, isn't it safe to say, Douglas, that there's a lot of blame to go around? Because the easiest thing to do in Washington is to spend money, right? Not to find money to cover that spending.
It's very easy to agree to spend money, and what they did in 2018 was just agree to spend more on defense and on non-defense discretionary. But what they didn't do in 2018, which they did twice under President Obama, was pay for that increase in spending with cuts elsewhere. That was missing in 2018. What I find disappointing about this budget is that there are only two things that matter in 2019. One is raising the debt limit. Number two is finding some agreement on how to avoid these budget caps that they wrote into law years ago. The budget is going to be silent on both of those.
And how about debt ceiling? I mean, Rana, do you see, because again, we run into this all the time, and then there's concerns about the U.S. Debt rating and so on as they push it up to that deadline there. I mean, is this going to be a real issue as you get close to that deadline?
I think that I guess I differ a little bit from a lot of liberals on this point. I think debt and deficits do matter, and I think that they matter more than ever now. I mean, we are in an unprecedented global debt bubble at the moment. There is multiple times the amount of debt out there in the world than there was 10 years ago before the financial crisis. So I think that we are really at a point where we need to start thinking about the U.S. debt and deficit issues. You're already seeing in the U.S. trade war with China, you're seeing talk about, there could be a currency war at some point too. So this is not a time to be racking up more and more debt when we're going probably into a downturn, and when interest rates, it's unclear what's going to happen. It could get a lot more expensive to pay that debt off at some point.
Douglas, I mean, you also have the trade
that's
deficit
a really important
rising
point.
at the same time period. But please go ahead. Tell me your reaction to Rana.
Look, I think this is a really important point. Our trade deficit and our budget deficit are related. Getting the budget deficit under control will help with the trade deficit. There's no question about it. But the issue with the debt is that things are always fine until they're not. And you cannot predict the moment at which things get rough. So don't run that risk. Develop a sensible plan that gets the debt stabilized. A sensible plan takes on the large majority of spending, which is over in the entitlement programs. It doesn't rely on one category of annual spending, which is going to be under 10% of the budget in the end. This is a really narrow category to focus on. It's picking a political fight. I understand that, but it's not a sensible long-run strategy.
And then tell me anytime human beings have actually taken preemptive action rather than wait till the sky fell. Any examples before we go?
Never waste a good crisis.
Just saying. Rana, Douglas, thanks very much.
Thank you.
New polling out this morning. While most Republicans agree that President Trump is still their guy in 2020, there is a dilemma among Democrats. The candidate they most want to beat the president has not yet even entered the race. And we are moments away from the opening bell on Wall Street. The markets mixed this morning. U.S. retail sales stabilized in January, but investigators worry about global growth from China, Europe, and the effects of Brexit.
Before the Bell is brought to you by E-Trade, the original place to invest online. And go to cnn.com/beforethebell to stay on top of the markets and sign up for the daily newsletter.
You should be.
New polling out today from the first contest of the 2020 election, that of course Iowa, and for Republicans, President Trump still their man heading into 2020. The president holding 81% approval among Republicans. This despite an onslaught of new investigations into his presidency, a failed North Korea summit, and a very public airing of his alleged porn star payoff. Joining me now to discuss this, CNN senior political writer and analyst Harry Enten, and former senior advisor for Trump's 2016 campaign, David Urban. Thanks to both of you. Good to have you on together. Harry, if I could use your polling wisdom here just for a moment here. 81%. I mean, that figure for Trump has remained fairly consistent among Republicans, has it not?
It has. In fact, his favorable rating, which is a slightly different question, is actually slightly up. I mean, these are just not the types of numbers in which you would expect there to be a serious challenger to the president. He's well liked by Republicans. Different polls that look at the horse race numbers clearly show that he's the favorite heading into 2020. If Donald Trump's going to be beat, it will be in the general election, not in the primary, at least as the polling looks at this point.
Dave Urban, a number in that poll said that 40% of folks identifying as Republican or Republican-leaning voters do support the president facing a challenger. However, do you consider that at all concerning?
No. So first of all, and Harry will speak to this too. These are registered Republicans, not likely voters. We don't know if these folks, they're not super voters. We don't know if they come to the polls. And look, it's Iowa. Folks in Iowa are used to seeing, their candidates 9-10 times in their local diners. They are very intimately involved with this process. Mm-hmm. But as you said, look, the numbers are huge. The president's numbers have ticked up 5% since December in this poll, from 77% to 82%. Favorability. Mm-hmm. That's unbelievable. And also in this poll, which I was not too surprised to see, over 60% of these folks agree with the president's emergency declaration for the wall. So these are pretty strong Trump supporters in Iowa.
They are. And to your point, David, Harry and I looked because I was curious what percentage of Democrats supported a challenger to Obama in the run-up to 2012, and I think we have those numbers on the screen, but it was similar figures, 45%. This is a Marist poll back in 2010, so a little further in advance of the 2012 election, but still, is this something, Harry Enten, that you see fairly common, even with relatively popular incumbent presidents among their own party?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the Barack Obama numbers go back to 1995. You see similar numbers with Bill Clinton. In fact, many more actually wanted a challenger nationwide. I think it was 66%. Look, we all like choices, right? I like Popeyes. I also like the idea that maybe there'll be a KFC down the line. But at the end of the day, I'm still going to choose Popeyes. I just like the choice to be there.
David, in case you don't know, David, Harry always relates it back to fried chicken because he is a connoisseur of the Popeyes, just so you know.
Well, listen. Also, interestingly, in this poll, if you look at the numbers, look. I was going to say, interestingly, if you look at the numbers here, amongst those the Republican voters, only a slim 11% said they might vote for a Democrat. There'd be somebody in the Democratic field that they would vote for. So 82%, 83%, I believe, said they would not support any of the Democrats. And Howard Schultz barely registers. So, it seems like that, the president would be cruising to re-election amongst Iowa voters.
No, it is at least in the primary, I mean, it's a very polarized electorate. We know that, no question. So, Harry, let's talk about the Democrats. Also in this Iowa poll, likely Democratic caucus goers, they found Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, by far really at the top of the list. I think we have those numbers as well, 27%, 25% respectively. The other candidates, Elizabeth Warren, Harris, they're down in single digits. Is this an enduring advantage for Biden and Sanders in your view?
I'm suspect that it's enduring insofar if you line up the name recognition, the people who can form an opinion of these different candidates, and then you look at the horse race numbers, you see a very clear correlation, right? Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, 96% of Democrats can say they can form an opinion of these candidates. No one else is really close. Of course, I will point out that we saw with President Trump when he was running in 2015, a lot of people said, oh, those early numbers, that's just name recognition. He was able to hold on to that lead. But I think it's still very, very early. Going back since 1980, only 6 of 14 times has the leader at this point actually won the caucuses out there. So a lot of time to go.
See, Harry, he's always got a number. He's always got a number.
And just look.
David, go ahead.
And I was going to say, just looking at those Democratic numbers, Jim, what I thought is interesting is the movement, right? So So Biden and Sanders are kind of stuck at that number where you see big movement among some of the folks. Kamala Harris's numbers move dramatically up in the favorable. That's what I think you'd like to see if you're a Democrat running. And also remember, Iowa voters tend to be much older, so they're going to skew towards less progressive candidates. I mean, that doesn't explain why Sanders, I think name ID is pretty high, but among some of the progressives, they're doing quite well in Iowa.
Final question, if I can, Harry, because you have even some Democrats, particularly moderate Democrats, expressing concern about, at least in public statements, a move to the left for the party. Is there evidence in this polling as to where Democratic voters, what kind of candidate they want in 2020? Do they want one more left of center or someone more moderate?
I mean, it's very interesting because you see that there are a lot of Democrats who do want a Medicare for all package. That to them is important. But at the same time, Bernie Sanders, who's obviously the furthest left of any of the Democrats, 44% of likely Iowa caucus Democratic goers say he is too liberal. And so I think you want to be further to the left than the average Democrat in past campaigns, but you don't want to be too far out to the left.
All right, Harry Ensign, David Urban, thanks very much to both of you.
Thank you.
We want him far to the left. We want him far to the left, Jim.
It would help feed the socialist line, which we're hearing more and more from this president, no question. Thanks to both of you. A top Democrat in the House says it was a mistake to allow President Trump to answer only written questions from the special counsel. Next, is there a chance that the president could still be subpoenaed? Is that a closed question? We'll discuss.
It's probably going to be dinner entrance.
Discover.
Hi, what's this Social Security alert?
It's a free alert if we find your Social Security number on the dark web.
Good, because I'm a little worried about my information getting out.
Oh, why's that?
My Social Security number is 875-6.
Okay, I see. Is that your daughter?
No, it's a macaw, and his name is Timothy.
Timmy, want a cracker?
Timmy, do you want a cracker?
What do you think, Kevin?
No.
Sign up online for free. Discover Social Security alerts.
Robert Mueller has wrapped up his Russia investigation. Yes, we're still waiting. House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff says that he still wants to hear President Trump testify under oath. So far, the president has only submitted written answers to written questions from the special counsel, a take-home test, as it were.
Yes, I think it is a mistake, and I've said all along that I don't think Bob Mueller should rely on written answers. I think the constraint that Bob Mueller is operating under is he had an acting attorney general who was appointed because he would be hostile to a subpoena on the president. And now he has a permanent attorney general who was chosen for the same hostility to his investigation, who would likely oppose that step.
Joining me now, CNN legal analyst, former federal prosecutor Laura Coates. Laura, great to have you on. I mean, is it a closed question here? I mean, is there still a possibility that the president could be subpoenaed to give in-person testimony as opposed to written testimony?
Well, it's really not a closed question, and Adam Schiff is correct. The idea that giving somebody a chance to have a take-home exam in the form of written answers doesn't really give you the transparency you'd like. They're normally highly vetted answers. You don't have a chance to actually do any follow-up questions if the line of inquiry will go that direction. When it comes to the president in particular, the Supreme Court has actually never had to rule specifically on whether or not the president of the United States could ultimately be compelled to testify, because most presidents have given up this inquiry. The question is not whether you can subpoena. That's pretty clear you could subpoena, but the question is whether or not he could actually refuse to comply with it. And if he were to try to refuse to comply with the subpoena, he'd have to have a very good reason, either under the Nixon administration sort of cases that he really had a privilege-based reason why he couldn't speak under oath or in an open public hearing or even in private. And under the Clinton era, it's idea the Supreme Court has said, well, look, listen, you have to be able to come to the judicial process, particularly if you are the head of the executive branch whose job it is to enforce the law. It's an open question, but it's going to be a long court battle to get there.
Have you, and again, special counsel knows a lot more than us about the president's answers and what he knows that either corroborates the president's answers or may contradict the president's answers. Based on what we know, though, in public, have you seen anything that, any evidence that the president has given inaccurate answers in those written answers to the special counsel's questions?
Well, certainly we've seen over the course of his administration, he has given many inconsistent statements. And then we have the actual written answers, which talk about things like, for example, the campaign finance issue, the idea of Michael Cohen, his relationship and his role to the actual payment of different things. You've seen inconsistencies going forward. The question will be whether or not you're able to actually compare the under oath statements by, say, Michael Cohen or Paul Manafort, or maybe Michael Flynn, if he's already testified before the grand jury, or a number of other people who have been very key in his actual campaign or as a surrogate, and then compare his written answers to that. The problem is it will be not a very fruitful comparison for the very reason that the people who testified under oath had follow-up questions, Jim. They were able to have different lines of inquiry, meander different directions, find out what they didn't know. Here, the president's statements have been explicitly confined to a short line of inquiry that had very little to do with perhaps things that happened after he was inaugurated. Remember, Mueller's inquiry had to do with the campaign. A lot of the statements being made about people, including Michael Cohen under oath that we've seen about a week and a half ago, were things that happened even after he was inaugurated. So the comparison will fall short.
Final question, Paul Manafort. Of course, there's the sentencing last week, which surprised a lot of people, 47 months, when the sentencing guidelines for those crimes close to 4 or 5 times that. You have the other case, the other sentencing this week in D.C. court, Judge Amy Berman Jackson, who's been very different in her approach to this case, often more critical of him and his defense team. Do you expect a stiffer sentence from her?
I do, and here's why. Unlike a trial where the person is able to at all times maintain their innocence, you can do so until you're blue in the face. It's your right as an American to be able to do so. But once you've actually pled guilty, meaning there was no trial or a jury of your peers that had to conclude your guilt, you have admitted it wholeheartedly. You've said, I have done these things. The judge normally has a different approach to it because you're not maintaining your innocence any longer and you've admitted to the proffer of facts. So you would expect when somebody has already pled guilty for a judge to look at it, on the one hand say, well, you have saved the government resources and the community time and energy. But on the other hand, you have said in no uncertain terms, I did these crimes. Also, the fact that this last judge, Judge Ellis, has gotten a lot of backlash, it may influence the new judge not to try to one-up or try to be on the same page, but to acknowledge that, look, this judge has the power to have a concurrent or a consecutive. This is a separate crime in Washington, D.C. She has every right to have it be maybe even the same 4-year period, maybe more, but it can run on top.